Marcus Thompson stepped off the military transport truck, his boots hitting the dusty ground of Camp Pendleton with a thud that seemed to echo his nervous heartbeat. The California sun beat down mercilessly on the new recruits as they gathered their gear and formed rough lines. At 22, Marcus was older than most of the fresh-faced soldiers around him, but his quiet demeanor and lean frame made him appear almost fragile among the sea of eager warriors. The drill sergeant's voice boomed across the courtyard like thunder, commanding immediate attention from every soul within 100 yards. Marcus straightened his shoulders and tried to blend into the crowd, but something about his careful movements and the way he avoided eye contact seemed to draw unwanted attention from his fellow recruits. "Look at this one," whispered Jake Morrison, a burly recruit from Texas whose chest seemed as wide as a barn door. "Bet he's never even held a real gun before." The comment sparked quiet laughter from the group of recruits who had naturally gravitated toward Jake's confident presence. Marcus pretended not to hear, focusing instead on the orientation packet clutched in his sweating palms. The first week at the barracks proved to be a nightmare that Marcus had never anticipated. While other recruits bonded over shared stories of high school football glory and weekend hunting trips, Marcus remained largely silent about his past. When pressed for details about his life before the military, he would simply say he was from a small town in Montana and needed a fresh start. This mysterious background only fueled more speculation and mockery from his bunkmates. During mess hall meals, Marcus often found himself sitting alone at the far end of long metal tables while groups of recruits swapped stories and formed friendships that would last through their military careers. The isolation wasn't entirely unwelcome to Marcus, who seemed to prefer the safety of solitude over the risk of revealing too much about himself. However, his quietness was mistaken for weakness by those who measured strength only in volume and bravado. The physical training sessions revealed another side of Marcus that surprised everyone, including himself. Despite his modest build, he could run longer distances than almost anyone in his unit, his breathing steady and controlled, while others gasped for air. His push-ups were perfect in form, his sit-ups endless in number. Yet even these displays of physical capability couldn't earn him respect from recruits who had already decided he wasn't worthy of their acceptance. "Thompson moves like he's scared of his own shadow," Jake would say during evening downtime, loud enough for Marcus to hear from his nearby bunk. "Wonder what he's hiding under all those long sleeves." Indeed, Marcus was one of the few recruits who always wore long-sleeved shirts whenever regulations permitted, even in the stifling heat that made others strip down to their undershirts at every opportunity. The teasing escalated when Marcus consistently excused himself from group showers, opting instead for quick private cleaning sessions in the early morning hours when most of his bunkmates were still asleep. Some recruits speculated he was hiding embarrassing scars or birthmarks, while others suggested more creative and cruel explanations for his modesty. The rumors grew more elaborate with each passing day, turning Marcus into a source of entertainment for bored soldiers. One particularly hot afternoon during combat training, Sergeant Williams noticed Marcus struggling with his rifle while wearing his customary long sleeves. Sweat poured down his face as he attempted to maintain proper shooting stance, despite the obvious discomfort of his clothing choice. The sergeant approached with the kind of stern expression that made even seasoned soldiers nervous. "Thompson, what's wrong with you?" Sergeant Williams barked, his voice carrying across the shooting range. "You're sweating like a pig in a blanket, and your aim is suffering because you can't move properly in all those clothes." Marcus mumbled something about sunburn sensitivity, but the excuse sounded weak even to his own ears. The sergeant's eyes narrowed with suspicion and growing impatience. In his 15 years of military service, he had seen every type of recruit imaginable, but Marcus Thompson presented a puzzle that defied easy categorization. There was something about the young man's careful movements and guarded expressions that suggested hidden depths beneath his unremarkable surface. "Strip down to your t-shirt like everyone else, soldier," the sergeant commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument or negotiation. "This isn't a fashion show, and I won't have your discomfort affecting your performance or the safety of your unit members." Marcus's face went pale despite the desert heat, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his sleeve buttons. Around the shooting range, other recruits had stopped their own training to watch the confrontation unfold. Jake and his followers smirked with anticipation, expecting to finally see whatever embarrassing secret Marcus had been hiding beneath his protective layers of clothing. The moment stretched out like elastic about to snap, tension building with each second of Marcus's hesitation. Marcus looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist in the middle of the open desert training ground. His breathing became shallow and quick, and for a moment it seemed like he might refuse the direct order despite the serious consequences such defiance would bring to his military career. The sergeant stepped closer, his patience clearly exhausted by Marcus's continued resistance to a simple and reasonable command. Other drill instructors had begun to notice the standoff, and whispered conversations started among the training staff about the strange recruit who seemed determined to hide something significant from his fellow soldiers. "Thompson, this is your last warning," Sergeant Williams said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level that somehow seemed more threatening than his previous shouting. "Either you follow orders like every other soldier in this unit, or you'll find yourself explaining your behavior to the commanding officer before this day is over." Marcus closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering courage for a battle that only he could see. His hands moved slowly toward his shirt buttons, each movement deliberate and heavy with the weight of a decision that would change everything about his life at the barracks. The watching recruits held their breath, sensing that they were about to witness something significant, though none of them could have guessed the true magnitude of what was about to be revealed. Marcus's fingers worked slowly at his shirt buttons, each one feeling like it weighed 100 pounds. The desert heat seemed to intensify around him as every eye on the shooting range focused on his trembling hands. Sweat dripped from his forehead, but it wasn't from the California sun anymore. It was the cold sweat of a man about to expose secrets he had spent years carefully hiding. Jake Morrison leaned forward with obvious anticipation, already preparing the jokes he would make about whatever embarrassing marks or scars Marcus was concealing. The other recruits formed a loose circle, their training forgotten in favor of this unexpected entertainment. Some held their phones discreetly, hoping to capture whatever humiliating revelation was about to unfold. When Marcus finally pulled off his long-sleeved shirt, the immediate reaction was not what anyone had expected. Instead of the embarrassing scars or strange birthmarks the recruits had imagined, they saw the edge of what appeared to be an intricate tattoo peeking from beneath his standard-issue t-shirt. The design was unlike anything they had seen before, with deep black lines and symbols that seemed to suggest something military in nature. "That's it?" Jake scoffed, his disappointment obvious to everyone within earshot. "All this drama over some ink? What's the big deal about a tattoo? Half the guys here have them." He gestured broadly toward other recruits, many of whom sported various designs on their arms and shoulders. The tension that had been building suddenly deflated as the crowd began to disperse, their curiosity apparently satisfied by what they perceived as an anticlimactic reveal. However, Sergeant Williams remained focused on Marcus with an intensity that made the young recruit increasingly uncomfortable. The sergeant's trained eye had caught details that the casual observers had missed. The visible portion of the tattoo showed craftsmanship and symbolism that suggested professional military artwork, not the typical designs chosen by civilians or new recruits. Marcus quickly pulled his t-shirt down and reached for his long-sleeved shirt, but the sergeant's sharp command stopped him mid-motion. "Leave it off, Thompson. If you're going to train like a soldier, you need to dress like one." The order was simple and direct, but Marcus's reaction suggested it carried implications far beyond basic uniform regulations. Throughout the remainder of the training session, Marcus's performance improved dramatically once he was no longer restricted by his extra layers of clothing. His rifle handling became precise and confident, his movements fluid and practiced. The change was so remarkable that even the recruits who had been mocking him began to take notice of his genuine military skills. During the lunch break that followed, whispered conversations spread throughout the mess hall about Marcus Thompson and his mysterious tattoo. Some recruits speculated that he was hiding gang affiliations or criminal history, while others wondered if he had served in a foreign military before joining the American forces. The theories grew more elaborate with each retelling, but none came close to the truth. Marcus sat alone at his usual table, methodically eating his meal while trying to ignore the stares and whispered comments from surrounding tables. His long-sleeved shirt was back in place, but the damage to his carefully maintained privacy had already been done. He could feel dozens of eyes studying him, searching for clues about his true identity and background. That evening in the barracks, the atmosphere was charged with curiosity and speculation. Jake Morrison had gathered his usual followers around his bunk, and their conversation inevitably turned to the day's events at the shooting range. They debated the possible meanings of the symbols they had glimpsed on Marcus's skin, each theory more outlandish than the last. Maybe he was in some special forces unit before, suggested one recruit, his voice filled with the kind of awe reserved for elite military units. Those guys get special tattoos to mark their service. The idea was quickly dismissed by Jake, who couldn't accept the possibility that the quiet, seemingly weak Marcus might have more military experience than anyone realized. Meanwhile, Marcus lay on his narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling and listening to the conversation swirling around him. He had spent 3 years carefully constructing a new identity, learning to speak differently, move differently, and present himself as just another small-town kid looking for direction in life. In a single afternoon, all of that careful work had begun to unravel. The next morning brought new challenges as word of Marcus's mysterious tattoo had spread beyond their immediate unit. Other drill sergeants began paying closer attention to the quiet recruit, watching his performance during exercises with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for problem soldiers or potential leaders. Marcus tried to maintain his low profile, but his natural skills kept breaking through the facade he had constructed. During hand-to-hand combat training, Marcus found himself paired against recruits who were eager to test themselves against the mysterious soldier. What they discovered shocked them into silence. Marcus moved with the fluid precision of someone who had been trained by the best military instructors in the world. His techniques were flawless, his reactions lightning fast, and his control absolute. He could disable opponents without injuring them, a skill that required years of intensive training to master. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" asked Tommy Rodriguez, a recruit from Los Angeles who had considered himself tough until he found himself flat on his back within seconds of engaging Marcus. The question hung in the air, but Marcus simply helped Tommy to his feet and moved on to the next exercise without providing any explanation. The mystery deepened when Lieutenant Collins, a decorated officer who supervised advanced training programs, stopped by to observe the new recruits. His attention was immediately drawn to Marcus, not because of the rumors about tattoos or hidden identity, but because of the unmistakable signs of advanced military training in everything the young man did. Lieutenant Collins approached Sergeant Williams after the training session, his expression serious and concerned. "That recruit Thompson," he said, gesturing toward where Marcus was cleaning his equipment with the methodical precision of a seasoned soldier. "There's something about him that doesn't add up. His movements, his knowledge, his instincts, they're all wrong for a new recruit." The sergeant nodded grimly, having reached similar conclusions over the past few days. "I've been thinking the same thing, sir. He knows things he shouldn't know, does things he shouldn't be able to do. And that tattoo he's hiding suggests some kind of military background he's not telling us about." As the days passed, Marcus found it increasingly difficult to maintain his carefully constructed cover story. His natural instincts and training kept surfacing despite his best efforts to appear inexperienced. During navigation exercises, he could read maps and use compass bearings with the skill of a professional soldier. In weapons training, he demonstrated knowledge of firearms that went far beyond what any civilian should possess. The other recruits began to view him with a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. Jake Morrison's bullying attempts became less frequent as it became clear that Marcus was not the weak target they had initially perceived. However, this change in attitude brought its own dangers, as increased attention made it harder for Marcus to hide the truth about his past. The breaking point came during a surprise inspection when Commander Harrison, the base's highest-ranking officer, made an unexpected visit to observe the new recruits. Marcus had no advance warning, no time to prepare or find an excuse to be elsewhere. As the commander walked through the ranks of soldiers standing at attention, Marcus could only hope that his secret would remain hidden for just a little longer. Commander Harrison walked through the barracks with the measured stride of a man who had inspected thousands of soldiers throughout his distinguished career. His steel-gray eyes missed nothing as they swept across the perfectly aligned recruits, each standing at rigid attention in their pressed uniforms. The commander's reputation preceded him everywhere he went, a legendary figure who had served in 3 different conflict zones and earned more commendations than most soldiers ever dream of receiving. Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs as the commander approached his section of the barracks. Every instinct screamed at him to maintain perfect military bearing, but those same instincts were part of what he was desperately trying to hide. He forced his breathing to remain steady and kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, praying that nothing would draw the commander's attention in his direction. The morning was unseasonably warm, and Sergeant Williams had ordered all recruits to wear their standard T-shirts for the inspection. Marcus had no choice but to comply, leaving his carefully concealed tattoo partially visible beneath the short sleeves of his regulation shirt. He could only hope that the commander would pass by quickly without noticing the intricate designs that marked him as something far different from a typical new recruit. Commander Harrison paused in front of Jake Morrison, examining his uniform and posture with the critical eye of a perfectionist. Jake stood perfectly still, his chest puffed out with pride at being selected for such scrutiny by the base's most important officer. The commander asked a few routine questions about Jake's background and motivation for military service, receiving the expected answers about patriotism and desire to serve his country. Moving down the line, the commander stopped briefly at several other recruits, offering words of encouragement to some and gentle corrections to others. His approach was professional, but fair, the kind of leadership that inspired loyalty among troops who served under his command. Each interaction revealed his deep understanding of human nature and his ability to assess character with remarkable accuracy. When Commander Harrison reached Marcus, something extraordinary happened. The older officer's casual glance became an intense stare as his eyes locked onto the visible portion of the tattoo beneath Marcus's sleeve. The commander's face underwent a dramatic transformation, color draining from his weathered features as recognition dawned in his experienced eyes. The silence stretched out for what felt like an eternity as Commander Harrison studied the symbols and designs that Marcus had tried so hard to keep hidden. Other recruits began to notice the extended pause, their curiosity piqued by the commander's obvious shock and the way his hands had begun to tremble slightly at his sides. Even Sergeant Williams looked confused by his superior officer's unexpected reaction. "Son," Commander Harrison said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to see the rest of that tattoo." The request was phrased politely, but everyone present understood it was actually an order that could not be refused. Marcus's face went completely white as he realized his carefully maintained secret was about to be exposed to everyone in the barracks. With trembling hands, Marcus began to roll up his sleeve, revealing more of the intricate tattoo that covered his upper arm. The design was unmistakably military in nature, featuring symbols and emblems that only someone with extensive knowledge of elite forces would recognize. As more of the artwork became visible, Commander Harrison's expression grew increasingly grave. The tattoo told a story that contradicted everything Marcus had claimed about his background. The symbols indicated service in special operations units, the kind of elite forces that accepted only the most highly trained and experienced soldiers. There were markings that suggested multiple deployments in classified locations, commendations for valor under fire, and involvement in operations that most people would never hear about. "Remove your shirt, soldier," Commander Harrison ordered, his voice regaining its authority despite his obvious emotional turmoil. Marcus hesitated for a moment, knowing that full exposure would destroy any remaining chance of maintaining his false identity, but disobeying a direct order from the base commander was not an option, regardless of the consequences. As Marcus pulled off his T-shirt, gasps echoed throughout the barracks. The tattoo was far more extensive than anyone had imagined, covering most of his back and both arms with an intricate tapestry of military honors, unit insignia, and memorial tributes. Each element had been carefully crafted by artists who specialized in military tattoos, creating a permanent record of service that could not be faked or duplicated. Commander Harrison stepped closer to examine the details, his experienced eyes reading the story written in ink across Marcus's skin. There were symbols from units so classified that their existence was rarely acknowledged publicly. Memorial tattoos honored fallen comrades whose names appeared on no public monuments. Service ribbons and commendations were represented with artistic precision that spoke of pride and extraordinary achievements. "Sergeant Williams," the commander said without taking his eyes off Marcus. "Clear the barracks. I need to speak with this soldier privately." The order was carried out immediately, with recruits filing out in confusion and whispered speculation about what they had witnessed. Jake Morrison tried to linger near the doorway, but a sharp look from Sergeant Williams sent him hurrying after the others. When they were alone, Commander Harrison walked around Marcus slowly, studying every detail of the tattoo with the intensity of an archaeologist examining priceless artifacts. His expression was a complex mixture of respect, confusion, and growing anger at what he perceived as deception on a massive scale. "I know this unit," Commander Harrison said, pointing to a particular emblem high on Marcus's shoulder blade. "I know this operation," he continued, indicating another symbol. "And I sure as hell know what this means," he finished, his finger hovering over a memorial tattoo that depicted crossed rifles and a soldier's helmet. Marcus remained silent, knowing that any explanation he might offer would only make the situation worse. He had known this moment would eventually come, had prepared for it during countless sleepless nights, but actually facing exposure felt far worse than he had imagined. The weight of 3 years of careful deception pressed down on him like a physical burden. "You're not Marcus Thompson from Montana," the commander stated flatly. "Marcus Thompson from Montana never existed, did he? This tattoo tells me you served with units that don't officially exist, in places that aren't on any map, doing things that never happened according to government records." The accuracy of the commander's assessment sent chills down Marcus's spine. Every word was true, and there was no point in continuing the charade that had somehow survived until this moment. His carefully constructed new identity was crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Commander Harrison walked to the window and stared out at the training grounds where other units were conducting their morning exercises. The sight of soldiers going through their routines seemed to help him process the shocking discovery he had just made. When he turned back to face Marcus, his expression was unreadable. "Put your shirt back on," he ordered quietly. "Then you're going to tell me exactly who you really are, what happened to bring you here under false pretenses, and why one of the most highly decorated soldiers I've ever encountered is pretending to be a green recruit who's never seen combat." Marcus pulled his shirt back on with mechanical movements, each gesture heavy with the weight of inevitable revelation. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind, but now that it was actually happening, all his carefully prepared explanations seemed inadequate and hollow. Commander Harrison settled into a chair and gestured for Marcus to sit across from him, creating an atmosphere more suited to confession than interrogation. "My real name is Captain David Michael Rodriguez," Marcus began, his voice barely above a whisper. The admission felt like removing a heavy mask he had worn for so long that he had almost forgotten his true face beneath it. "I served 8 years in special operations before everything fell apart 3 years ago." Commander Harrison leaned forward, his experienced eyes studying every micro-expression on the younger man's face. In his decades of military service, he had learned to recognize the difference between elaborate lies and painful truths. What he saw in David's expression was the haunted look of a soldier carrying unbearable memories. The story that emerged over the next hour was one of heroism twisted into tragedy by the cruel mathematics of war. Captain Rodriguez had led a classified rescue operation in a hostile region where American operatives had been captured by enemy forces. The mission had been deemed impossible by conventional military thinking, but David's unit specialized in achieving the impossible through superior training, advanced equipment, and unwavering dedication to their brothers in arms. The operation had succeeded beyond all expectations. David's team had infiltrated the enemy compound, neutralized all threats, and successfully extracted the captured operatives without losing a single American life. Military intelligence classified the mission as a textbook example of special operations excellence, and recommendations for commendations were submitted through proper channels. However, 3 weeks after their return to base, everything changed when a political firestorm erupted over the mission. Foreign governments complained about sovereignty violations, media outlets questioned the legality of the operation, and politicians who had privately approved the mission publicly denied any knowledge of it. The successful rescue that should have been celebrated became a liability that needed to be contained. They needed someone to blame, David continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke the truth he had carried alone for 3 years. The politicians couldn't admit they had authorized the mission, so they claimed it was unauthorized. My commanding officer was transferred to a desk job in Alaska. The intelligence analysts who provided our information were reassigned to different departments, and I was charged with conducting unauthorized operations and violating international law. Commander Harrison's jaw tightened as he listened to a story that was all too familiar in modern military politics. He had witnessed similar situations where successful operations became political embarrassments, leaving the soldiers who had risked their lives holding the consequences of decisions made far above their pay grade. The court-martial proceedings had been a nightmare of classified testimony and closed hearings. David's achievements and spotless record counted for nothing against the political necessity of finding a scapegoat. Character witnesses were prevented from testifying due to security classifications. Evidence of the mission's success was sealed. Under national security provisions, David found himself defending actions he was proud of in a system determined to find him guilty. "They offered me a deal," David said, staring at his hands as if the memory was written there in invisible ink. "Plead guilty to a reduced charge, accept a dishonorable discharge, and they would keep the worst allegations out of the public record. Fight the charges, and they would pursue the maximum penalty, including potential jail time and complete destruction of my military service record." The choice had been an impossible one. Fighting the charges meant risking everything on a legal system that had already demonstrated its willingness to sacrifice individual soldiers for political convenience. Accepting the deal meant admitting guilt for actions he believed were not only justified but heroic. Either way, his military career was over and his reputation destroyed. David had chosen to fight, believing that truth and justice would eventually prevail. The decision cost him everything. The court-martial found him guilty on multiple charges despite overwhelming evidence of his competence and dedication. His commendations were revoked, his service record was permanently tainted, and he was discharged. In disgrace from the military he had served with distinction. "The worst part wasn't losing my career," David admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "It was watching my men get transferred to different units, forbidden from speaking about what really happened. Some of them tried to testify on my behalf, and found their own careers threatened. I realized that my fight was destroying the lives of soldiers who had followed my orders in good faith." After his discharge, David had struggled to find his place in civilian society. Potential employers were unwilling to hire someone with a dishonorable discharge, regardless of his skills and experience. Friends from his military days were reluctant to associate with someone who had become a symbol of disgrace, even though they privately believed in his innocence. The isolation and rejection had driven him to dark places where he questioned everything he had believed about honor, duty, and sacrifice. The decision to enlist under a false identity had come after months of desperation and soul-searching. David had used his special operations training to create a new identity, complete with fabricated personal history and forged documents. He had studied how to change his appearance, speech patterns, and mannerisms to become Marcus Thompson, a simple, small-town kid with no military experience. "I just wanted to serve again," David explained, meeting Commander Harrison's eyes for the first time since beginning his confession. "The military was the only life I had ever known, the only place I had ever felt like I belonged. I thought, maybe if I started over, proved myself again from the bottom up, I could earn back the right to wear the uniform with pride." Commander Harrison sat in silence for several minutes after David finished his story, processing the implications of what he had heard. The situation was unprecedented in his experience, presenting legal and ethical challenges that had no clear precedents or easy solutions. A decorated officer was serving under false pretenses, but his motives were driven by love for the military, rather than any malicious intent. "Do you have any proof of what really happened 3 years ago?" the commander asked finally. David shook his head sadly, explaining that all documentation from his court-martial was classified and sealed. The men who had served under his command were scattered across different units and forbidden from discussing the operation that had defined their careers. The room fell silent again, as both men contemplated the impossible situation they now faced. David had violated numerous regulations by enlisting under a false identity, but his service as Marcus Thompson had been exemplary. He was simultaneously one of the most decorated soldiers Commander Harrison had ever encountered, and one of the most problematic cases he would have to resolve. "What happens now, sir?" David asked, his voice carrying the resignation of a man who had already lost everything once and was prepared to lose it again. Commander Harrison looked at the young officer who had sacrificed his identity for the chance to serve his country, and realized that this decision would define not only David's future but his own legacy as a leader. Commander Harrison stood and walked to his office safe, withdrawing a secure communication device that David recognized as equipment used for classified military correspondence. The commander's expression was thoughtful and determined as he began, typing a message that would either destroy David's second chance or provide him with the vindication he had been denied 3 years earlier. "I'm sending an inquiry to some old contacts in Special Operations Command," Commander Harrison explained, as his fingers moved quickly across the encrypted keyboard. "There are people in the system who remember what really happened, even if they weren't allowed to speak publicly at the time. Military politics may have buried the truth, but it doesn't erase the memories of the men who witnessed your actions firsthand." David felt a mixture of hope and terror at the commander's words. The prospect of vindication was everything he had dreamed about during 3 years of exile from his true identity, but he also knew that reopening old wounds could lead to consequences even worse than his current situation. The same political forces that had destroyed his career once were still in positions of power, and unlikely to welcome renewed scrutiny of their past decisions. Over the following days, David found himself in an impossible limbo. He continued training, with his unit as Marcus Thompson, but the pretense had become increasingly difficult to maintain, now that his true identity was known to the base commander. The other recruits sensed that something had changed, though they couldn't identify exactly what was different about their mysterious bunkmate. Jake Morrison and his followers continued their casual mockery, unaware that the man they were taunting had led missions that would become case studies in special operations schools for decades to come. Their jokes about Marcus's supposed weakness and inexperience took on a surreal quality when viewed against the reality of his actual military record. Meanwhile, Commander Harrison's investigation was yielding unexpected results. His carefully worded inquiries to former colleagues in special operations had triggered a chain reaction of responses from officers who had been waiting 3 years for someone in authority to ask the right questions. The consensus was unanimous. Captain David Rodriguez had been sacrificed to protect politicians who had authorized a necessary but politically sensitive operation. The breakthrough came when Colonel Sarah Matthews, now serving at the Pentagon, responded to Commander Harrison's inquiry with information that had been buried in classified files for years. She revealed that multiple intelligence agencies had been tracking the terrorist cell that had captured the American operatives, and that David's mission had not only rescued the hostages, but had also provided crucial intelligence that prevented several planned attacks on American soil. The operation Rodriguez led saved hundreds, possibly thousands of civilian lives, Colonel Matthews wrote in her encrypted response. The intelligence gathered during the rescue mission led directly to the disruption of 3 separate terrorist plots targeting major American cities. For political reasons, this information was never presented at his court-martial, but it's all documented in files that carry the highest classification levels. More revelations followed as other officers added their voices to the growing chorus of support for David's reputation. The men who had served under his command during the rescue operation had all been promoted and decorated for their service in subsequent years, a fact that contradicted the official narrative that portrayed their mission as unauthorized and reckless. Commander Harrison shared these developments with David during a private meeting in his office. Watching as hope began to replace the resignation, that had defined the younger officer's demeanor for years. The prospect of clearing his name was overwhelming, but David had been disappointed too many times to fully embrace the possibility of redemption. "There's something else you need to know," Commander Harrison said, his expression growing serious. "The terrorist leader you captured during that rescue mission was killed 2 weeks ago in a drone strike. His death has declassified certain aspects of the intelligence he provided, including confirmation that your operation prevented attacks that would have killed thousands of innocent people." The news hit David like a physical blow. For 3 years, he had questioned whether his sacrifice had been worth the cost, whether the lives saved justified the destruction of his career and identity. Learning that the mission's success had been even greater than he had known provided vindication that was both healing and overwhelming. Commander Harrison's investigation had also uncovered procedural irregularities in David's court-martial that cast serious doubt on the legitimacy of his conviction. Key evidence had been suppressed, witnesses had been intimidated, and the judge advocate assigned to his case had been selected specifically because of his willingness to prioritize political considerations over military justice. "I'm recommending that your case be reopened for review by the Military Appeals Court," Commander Harrison announced. "The evidence we've gathered suggests that your conviction was based on politically motivated prosecutorial misconduct rather than actual wrongdoing on your part." The possibility of having his conviction overturned and his military record restored was more than David had dared hope for when he first enlisted under his false identity. However, he also understood that challenging his conviction would require him to abandon his carefully constructed new life as Marcus Thompson and face the risk of additional charges for his deception. As word of Commander Harrison's investigation began to spread through unofficial channels, David found himself receiving unexpected support from quarters he had never anticipated. Officers who had served in special operations units reached out through secure communications to offer testimony about his character and competence. Intelligence analysts who had worked with his unit provided documentation of the mission's success that had been hidden from his original defense team. The momentum building behind David's case even attracted attention from military journalists who specialized in exposing injustices within the armed forces. They had been investigating similar cases where successful operations had been disavowed for political reasons, and David's story provided compelling evidence of systemic problems within military justice systems. However, not everyone was pleased with Commander Harrison's efforts to revisit the past. Political figures who had built their careers on the narrative that portrayed David as a rogue operator began making inquiries about why classified information was being reviewed without proper authorization. The same forces that had destroyed David's career once were mobilizing to prevent his vindication. The situation reached a critical point when David received an unofficial warning through military channels that powerful people were working to have him charged with additional crimes related to his false enlistment. The message was clear: drop the appeal and accept permanent exile from military service, or face the possibility of actual imprisonment for the deception he had employed to return to uniform. David found himself facing the same impossible choice that had defined his life 3 years earlier. He could continue fighting for justice and risk losing everything again, or he could accept defeat and disappear permanently from the military life he loved. This time, however, he was not alone in the battle. Commander Harrison made a decision that would define his legacy as a military leader. Instead of backing down in the face of political pressure, he chose to escalate David's case to the highest levels of military command. Using his decades of service and impeccable reputation as leverage, he requested a personal meeting with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to present evidence that had been systematically suppressed for 3 years. The meeting took place in a secure conference room at the Pentagon, where Commander Harrison laid out the complete story of Captain David Rodriguez's persecution and the subsequent cover-up that had destroyed an exemplary officer's career. The evidence was overwhelming. Mission reports that contradicted the official narrative, testimony from special operations personnel who had been silenced, and intelligence documents proving that David's actions had saved countless American lives. General Patricia Williams, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, listened with growing anger as the scope of the injustice became clear. She had built her career on the principle that the military must protect its own, especially when they had acted with honor and courage in impossible circumstances. The fact that political considerations had been allowed to destroy a decorated officer's life represented everything she opposed about the intersection of military service and civilian politics. "This is exactly the kind of case that destroys faith in military justice," General Williams declared after reviewing the evidence. "We cannot allow politics to trump honor, and we cannot permit good soldiers to be sacrificed for the convenience of politicians who lack the courage to stand behind their own decisions." Within 48 hours of that meeting, David's case was fast-tracked through the military appeals process, with a level of attention typically reserved for matters of national security. A panel of military judges was assembled to review his conviction, and they were provided with access to classified materials that had been withheld from his original defense team. The appeals hearing was conducted in a secure facility with the highest security clearances. As much of the evidence involved ongoing intelligence operations and classified sources, David testified about his actions during the rescue mission, finally able to tell his complete story without political restrictions or security limitations. His testimony was corroborated by soldiers who had served under his command and who were now permitted to speak freely about events they had been forced to hide for years. The verdict was unanimous and decisive. The appeals court found that David's original conviction had been based on false testimony, suppressed evidence, and prosecutorial misconduct that violated every principle of military justice. Not only was his conviction overturned, but the court recommended that he be reinstated to active duty with full restoration of his rank and military record. General Williams personally delivered the news to David during a ceremony at Camp Pendleton that was attended by his former commanding officers and the soldiers who had served under his leadership. The restoration of his identity felt surreal after 3 years of living as someone else, but the presence of his military family made the moment feel genuine and earned. "Captain Rodriguez," General Williams said during the ceremony, "your country owes you an apology for the injustice you suffered, but more importantly, we owe you recognition for the heroism you displayed not just during your original mission, but in your determination to continue serving despite the obstacles placed in your path." The revelation of David's true identity sent shockwaves through Camp Pendleton, particularly among the recruits who had served alongside Marcus Thompson. Jake Morrison and his followers were stunned to learn that the man they had mocked and ridiculed was actually one of the most decorated special operations officers of his generation. The jokes and casual cruelty they had directed toward him took on a different character when viewed against the reality of his sacrifice and service. Some recruits felt embarrassed by their treatment of David, while others were inspired by his willingness to start over from the bottom in pursuit of his calling to serve. Jake Morrison himself requested a private meeting with David to apologize for his behavior, an encounter that became a defining moment for both men. "I don't know how you stood it," Jake admitted during their conversation. "If I had your record and experience, I would have put us all in our place on the first day." David's response revealed the depth of character that had enabled him to endure 3 years of exile from his true identity. "Pride was what got me into trouble in the first place," David explained. "Learning to serve without recognition, to do the right thing even when no one was watching, turned out to be the most valuable lesson I've ever learned. You and the others helped teach me that, even if you didn't realize it at the time." David's reinstatement to active duty was accompanied by assignment to a new special operations unit, where his experience and hard-won wisdom could be put to optimal use. However, he chose to complete his basic training at Camp Pendleton alongside the recruits who had unknowingly served as his teachers in humility and perseverance. The tattoo that had nearly exposed his secret became a symbol of redemption rather than concealment. During graduation ceremonies for his basic training class, David wore his dress uniform with pride, knowing that every symbol of service and sacrifice on his body had been earned through genuine dedication to ideals larger than himself. Commander. Harrison was promoted to general shortly after David's reinstatement, recognition for his courage in fighting institutional injustice, even when it would have been easier to maintain the status quo. In his promotion speech, He credited David's case with reminding him why he had chosen military service in the first place. Years later, David's story became a case study in military academies about the importance of institutional integrity and the dangers of allowing political considerations to override military justice. His willingness to sacrifice his identity for the opportunity to serve became an inspiration for officers facing their own ethical challenges. The small-town kid from Montana named Marcus Thompson had never existed, but the lessons learned during his brief life had transformed Captain David Rodriguez into a leader worthy of the trust placed in him by the soldiers under his command. Sometimes the greatest victories require temporary defeats, and sometimes the most important battles are fought not against external enemies, but against the systems that should protect those who serve with honor. In the end, the tattoo that had almost destroyed David's carefully constructed new life became the instrument of his salvation, proving that truth has a way of surfacing even when buried under years of deception and political expedience. The symbols of service and sacrifice that he had tried to hide became beacons that guided him back to the honor and recognition he had never stopped deserving.